following episode depicts violence, murder, attempted murder, and bombings. Listener discretion is advised. On the evening of February 3rd, 1992, Bridget DiIorio Volungis dropped her husband off at their home on Porter Street in Worcester. An hour later, DiIorio returned home to find her husband, John Volungis Jr., dead inside the entrance to their duplex home. John had been stabbed 18 times. His throat had been slit. There were no sign of forced entry. John hadn't been robbed. At the time of his murder, police believed whoever killed him was waiting inside the home for him to arrive. And over 30 years later, John's murder remains unsolved. Welcome to Unsolved Worcester. I'm your host, Dan Yeager. In today's episode, we look at the February 3rd, 1992 murder of 21-year-old John Volungis Jr. John was killed the night before he was scheduled to leave Worcester to start a military career on the West Coast. A month before he was killed, John bought a $150,000 life insurance policy, and DiIorio was the sole beneficiary. Unsolved Worcester takes a deep dive every Tuesday and Thursday into unsolved murders and missing persons cases under investigation by the Worcester Police Department's Detective Unit. We will be looking to the past to unsolved murders as far back as the early 1950s and 60s. The approach to Unsolved Worcester is this: shine a light on each of these cases, put a life behind each victim's name, provide a timeline of events and important details, and ask questions that still need to be answered. Our goal is to remind residents of the Worcester area, both past and present, that there are dozens of unsolved homicides and missing persons cases that need resolution. We hope we can be the spark needed to solve a case. Before we get to the night of John's murder and its aftermath, we have to go back a few years to early 1990. John and Bridget DiIorio had already started dating. At the time, John was 19 years old, DiIorio was 31. John, originally of Auburn, was a graduate of St. John's High School. He had an associate's degree in law enforcement, and he had a part-time job at UPS. In March 1990, John was arrested in connection to the ambush shooting of DiIorio's ex-boyfriend, James Maroney. Maroney and DiIorio had stopped dating about 6 months earlier, and DiIorio started dating John shortly after. Maroney was shot outside of his home on Harrington Way in Worcester. 4 rounds from a 12-gauge shotgun were fired at Maroney, leaving him with multiple shotgun wounds in his chest and shoulder. Maroney survived the shooting, and John was arrested and charged with 3 counts of assault with intent to murder. According to court records, Maroney's father testified that while laying bleeding on the family's kitchen floor, his son said, quote, "Remember, if I die, John Volungis shot me." During the trial, DiIorio testified that Maroney called her several times earlier during the day he was shot, and then met with Maroney at the Greendale Mall later that afternoon. DiIorio said Maroney grabbed her by the throat when he saw John's dog tags hanging in the car. While they were in the mall, DiIorio testified Maroney held on to her the whole time by the back of her pants. She also testified Maroney called her home at 7:30 p.m. the night of the shooting, and that she saw John around 9 p.m. She said she didn't tell John she had seen Maroney during the day. The next time she heard from John was March 16th, when John was calling her from jail following his arrest. John was held on $100,000 bail. Following an 8-day trial, roughly 9 months later, a 12-member Worcester Superior Court jury found John not guilty on December 21, 1990. The night before, December 20th, 1990, John and DiIorio got married. According to a report from the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, John's lawyer was surprised by the not guilty verdict and would later admit that the physical evidence against John was overwhelming. His lawyer told the TNG, quote, "It was my one miracle for this lifetime." Fast forward to February 1992, 14 months after John Volungis Jr. and Bridget DiIorio are married. It's February 3rd, around 8:30 p.m. DiIorio discovers John's body in their home, about an hour after she had dropped him off there. John had been stabbed repeatedly to death by someone likely waiting in the home for him to come home. DiIorio told police after she dropped John off at their home, she went to pick up their children at a relative's house. But when she returned and found John's body, she didn't have her children with her. She said she changed her mind at the last minute and let her kids stay the night with their relatives. John was supposed to leave the next morning to California for 6 months of active duty in the Army Reserve. John's parents described John and DiIorio's marriage to the Telegram and Gazette as stormy. They said they had moved back to their Auburn home a few times over the 14 months. But 3 weeks before his death and days after he signed a $150,000 life insurance policy, John and DiIorio made up, and John moved back into their Porter Street home. The lead investigator in the case, Worcester Police Detective John McKernan, would later name DiIorio in an affidavit as a suspect in the murder investigation. John's mother, Linda, agreed with McKernan, also stating in an affidavit during a dispute over John's $150,000 life insurance policy that DiIorio shouldn't benefit from John's death as she is, quote, "a suspect in the investigation of the murder of my son." DiIorio, the sole beneficiary of the life insurance policy, filed a claim for the $150,000 policy 1 month after John was killed in early 1992. 2 years later, in early 1994, DiIorio and John's family found themselves in Worcester Superior Court, battling for the proceeds of the policy and for a second life insurance policy from the U.S. Army Reserves for $100,000. The civil case would go on for years, and during those years, bits of information would pop out that would surprise people. They certainly surprised us. In June 1997, during court proceedings over the life insurance policy, as John's mother still worked to convince the jury that DiIorio was responsible for John's death, an insurance representative testified that DiIorio called the life insurance agency 3 days before John was murdered to make sure the life insurance policies were still active. John's sister April also testified that 1 month before he was murdered, John told her if something happened to him, go to the police and tell them DiIorio had him killed. April had given the same testimony to police over 5 years before on the night of John's murder. Days later, on June 10th, 1997, a jury would find DiIorio an accessory before the fact to John's murder and more likely than not was involved in her husband's killing. However, 1 year after that, in June 1998, The judge overturned the ruling, citing the jury could only have come to their conclusion through speculation and not by evidence introduced during the trial, ultimately granting the life insurance policy benefits to DiIorio. The judge's verdict was appealed by John's family, but was upheld in appeals court. We're going to ask you to go back in time again with us once more. It's early fall 1991, less than 6 months before John's murder. John's father, John Sr., tells the Worcester Telegram and Gazette his son and DiIorio were separated, but attending counseling sessions. One night, John was bringing DiIorio flowers to the home on Porter Street. When he arrived, DiIorio came to the door in a towel, and a man, allegedly Patsy Santamaria Jr., came out of the bedroom. John trashed the house and was later served a restraining order. And that's the moment where things likely really changed for John, a period of roughly 6 months before his death, where things went off the rails. A young man with a promising future struggling to keep his grip on his marriage to an older woman with a history of enjoying the company of other men. The decisions John would make over half of a year, for better or worse, would help put another name on the short list of suspects in his murder. In early November 1991, 3 pipe bombs go off outside of the home at 25 Bluebell Road. 2 vehicles, the home and the garage, were all damaged. The house belonged to Patrick Santamaria Sr., father of Patsy Santamaria Jr., the man John Volungis Jr. found in his home with his wife Bridget DiIorio just 2 months before. The Santamaria family owns Pat's Service Center on Shrewsbury Street in Worcester. In 1998, the trial of 2 men charged in the bombing, Mark Dion and Larry Howerton. A federal agent testifies investigators believe the bombing was a result of the romantic relationship between Patsy Santamaria and Bridget DiIorio. Dion and Howerton worked with John at UPS in Shrewsbury. John's father would later tell the Telegram and Gazette police came looking for John the night of the bombings. 3 months after the bombing, John was killed. Patsy Santamaria was never named a suspect in the case. However, another name surfaced as a possible suspect. During an unrelated mob trial in federal court in 1998, the same year Howerton and Dion went on trial for the bombings, a Worcester police detective named Matteo Trotto as a suspect in the murder of John Volungis. According to court records, Trotto has ties to organized crime, and the Trotto and Santamaria families are related. Trotto was found guilty for his role in the kidnapping and murder of Kevin Harkins in 1994. He had already been serving a 23-year sentence for a 1999 cocaine trafficking charge. Then Trotto was initially sentenced to life in prison for first-degree murder of Harkins in 2014. But in early 2022, Trotto won an appeal and was resentenced to 15 years in prison and received a reduced charge of second-degree murder. As we go through each of these cases, we can't help but notice the connections from one case to another. And that trend will continue next episode too. But for now, if you go back and listen to our 2-part episode on the murder of Candace Scola, you'll notice some striking similarities between Candace's murder and John's murder. Each crime scene, there were no signs of forced entry or robbery. Both Candace and John were stabbed multiple times in their home. Both were married, but in tumultuous relationships. Both John and Candace were getting ready to move on with their lives. There are named suspects, possible motives, and life insurance benefits hanging over each case. And though they were killed over 10 years apart, as fate would have it, John and Candace knew each other. According to the Telegram and Gazette, John's mother and Candace's mother were best friends in school, and John's mother was a bridesmaid in Candace's mother's wedding. John and Candace played together as children and were friendly through their teenage years. But still to this day, decades later, no arrests have been made in either case. Thank you for listening. Anyone with information about the murder of John Volungis Jr. are asked to contact the Worcester Police Detective Bureau at 508-799-8651 or send an anonymous text to 274-637. Write TIP-WPD plus your message, or send an anonymous web-based message at worcesterma.gov/police. I'm Dan Yeager. Come back next time as we look at the unsolved murder of Paul Moreno, found dead in the trunk of a car at Pat's Service Center in Worcester in January 2000. Be sure to visit Unsolved Worcester on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Unsolved Worcester. Listen to all episodes for free at unsolvedworcester.com and podcast streaming platforms including Spotify, iTunes, and more. Special thanks to Harvest Design in Northborough, the extensive research provided by Alex London and the Worcester Public Library, the Worcester Police Department, the City of Worcester, Ron Scott at New England Sky Picks, and our sponsors for making this possible. The Unsolved Worcester podcast music is provided by Tom Lebelzik of the Worcester Jazz Collective. This episode of Unsolved Worcester is written and produced by Pat Sargent. Drone footage provided by New England Sky Picks. Videography and editing by Colin Turner. Victim images are courtesy of the Worcester Police Department. Sponsorship information announcer is Chandler Walsh. Unsolved Worcester website and logo art by Harvest Design. Visit harvest-design.com. Be sure to check out the video for this episode with exclusive aerial views and more on our Unsolved Worcester YouTube page. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button.